24 cases. And in those 24 cases, our clients have been awarded damages of over $700 million.
Oh my God, that's
a
staggering sum. But with the exception of one former Haitian death squad leader who had won the Florida lottery, those damages are almost never collected. Usually the accused don't have it, or they leave the country without paying. But Carmen says for her clients, that's not the point. They want accountability. They want closure. They want a court of law to acknowledge what happened to them. And if the criminal justice system isn't going to provide that, that's where they step in.
We sue war criminals because our government doesn't prosecute them.
Their lawsuit contains evidence about Lasantha's killing, including findings from a Sri Lankan police investigation that tracked the alleged killer's cell phones as they fled the scene of the crime.
The cell phone evidence that we've been able to obtain will forensically demonstrate that this group of assassins basically just fled into a compound that was military access only.
Police identified the alleged assassins as part of a military intelligence unit linked to other attacks on journalists, all while under the command of Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Just as Carmen's team is building the case against Rajapaksa, they learn their window to sue him in the U.S. is quickly closing. Rajapaksa, remember, is an American citizen, and Carmen's team hears that he's making one last trip to California. The rumor is he plans to renounce his U.S. citizenship so he can run for president of Sri Lanka.
And so we really saw this as our only chance to bring a case against him.
Carmen's team had been sharing information with different agencies inside the U.S. government. Federal officials knew they were tracking Rajapaksa. And then, right before they were about to serve this lawsuit, they checked back one last time.
I mean, we told them what we were doing.
With no indication that DOJ would bring charges, they moved.
We got you on tape, sir. You gotta take them. You've been served. Good job. Come on, let's go.
Several human rights lawyers describe the same experience. They share evidence with the human rights section at DOJ, hoping their lawsuits will trigger federal investigations and criminal charges. But one of them told me it feels like passing information into a black box.
I very much empathize with that point of view.
I talked with one former DOJ prosecutor who used to work inside that black box.
I think that's probably exactly what it looks like to NGOs that are doing a lot of work gathering evidence.
Mona Sahaf was a prosecutor at the Human Rights Section until 2021. For 6 years, she was in a key position to hold human rights violators accountable. But she isn't able to talk about any of those cases.
I don't think any of my human rights cases became public, so I don't have one to talk about, unfortunately. I did some investigations, some that were closed, some that are still ongoing on the human rights side, but didn't end up charging anything.
We know the DOJ never charged Rajapaksa, but what happened to the evidence that was shared with them? Did they investigate him for war crimes?
So anything that I worked on that's non-public, I can't, discuss. I can't comment on its existence or non-existence, unfortunately.
Should they have investigated him?
Can we turn off the recording for a second?
Mona can't say anything else. Deciding whether or not to bring a case often hinges on one critical question. Is it important enough for the U.S. government to get involved? And Mona says when the government weighs all the interests it has to balance around the world, human rights cases aren't at the top of the list.
Bringing human rights cases and bringing accountability to the victims of human rights abuses is just not our number one priority.
If bringing accountability to the victims of human rights abuses was truly the number one priority, this work would look a lot different. U.S. human rights laws are still lagging behind the rest of the world. We don't have a crimes against humanity statute. the law that was first used at Nuremberg and this year led to the conviction of a Syrian colonel in Germany. We don't have that law here. And the list of atrocities that the U.S. military and government leaders have been accused of committing rivals anywhere else in the world. Every major human rights violation you can think of. And none of the alleged perpetrators of those crimes were ever charged under substantive human rights statutes. DOJ veteran Eli Rosenbaum has dedicated his life to holding perpetrators of atrocities accountable. He deeply understands how important and how frustrating this work can be.
I would say the fact that the vast majority of human rights violators from World War II until now have not been brought to justice is really the great human rights tragedy of the post-war world, right? These crimes must never again be committed. And yet the crimes have continued to be perpetrated. Genocide, war crimes, all of the worst human rights violations. And so we ended up with the worst possible scenario, which is that someone taking part in these crimes probably knows that in all likelihood, he or she will get away with it.
So, what about the civil case against Gotabaya Rajapaksa? After those legal documents were dropped at his feet in April 2019, he finished his grocery trip and soon got on a plane back to Sri Lanka, where he renounced his U.S. citizenship.
I'm only a Sri Lankan citizen. I have solved this matter legally.
Mounted a presidential campaign.
Those campaigning for Gotabaya Rajapaksa say he's a terminator, but won't be an authoritarian leader.
And then
Gotabaya Rajapaksa has claimed victory in the Sri Lankan presidential election.
Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected president of Sri Lanka on November 17th, 2019.
I love my country. I'm proud of my country, and I have a vision for the future of this country.
We tried to talk with President Rajapaksa, but his press office declined our request. More than a decade after overseeing the brutal end of Sri Lanka's civil war, and months after being sued, Rajapaksa gained presidential immunity. While he's in office, he can't be sued. The closest he has ever come to facing allegations against him was being handed those documents in that Trader Joe's parking lot. I reached out to Ahimsa Wickrematunge, daughter of journalist Lasantha Wickrematunge. I asked her about what the U.S. government's decision not to bring charges meant to her. And she wrote this back. I continue to be astounded by the fact that despite overwhelming evidence against him and clear responsibility in heinous atrocities committed in Sri Lanka, the U.S. government never prosecuted him. I think that sends a powerful message to dictators and war criminals all over the world that brutality and murder will have few repercussions in the United States. It is senseless and it is infuriating. As we were getting ready to release this story, President Rajapaksa faced a new tidal wave of criticism. Sri Lanka's economy cratered. People are running out of fuel, food, and medicine. And observers are calling it Sri Lanka's Arab Spring. In a photo from one of the rallies, I saw a protester holding a sign quoting Lasantha. It said, "If we don't speak now, there'll be no one to speak for those who can't. Hashtag Go Home Gota." It's not a courtroom, but this accountability is harder to ignore. Neroli Price and I produced this show. Brett Myers edited today's episode with help from Andy Donahue. Thanks to Sean Musgrave and Jad Abumrad. Victoria Baranetsky is our general counsel. Our production manager is Amy Mustafa. Score and sound design by Jim Briggs and Fernando Arruda. They had help this week from Stephen Rascon, Catherine Steyer-Martinez, and Jess Alvarenga. Our digital producer is Sarah Merck. Our CEO is Kezar Kampwala. Sumi Agarwal is our editor-in-chief, and our executive producer is Kevin Sullivan. Our theme music is by Camarado Lightning. Support for Reveal is provided by the Reva and David Logan Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Heising Simons Foundation, the Hellman Foundation, the Democracy Fund, and the In As Much Foundation. Reveal is a